Welcome to the Pacific Southwest District Podcast. It's our second episode discussing ministry and mission with friends throughout the district. I'm Jim Hinkle, your host, the ministry executive for the PSD, and I am joined today by two friends and pastoral colleagues, Drew Ross of Christ Lutheran Church, Costa Mesa and Huntington Beach, Quincy Call of Mount Olive Lutheran Church, Poway, and Christ the Cornerstone Lutheran Church, Mira Mesa. Just those introductions gives us an indication that you are in partnership ministries. And that's our emphasis today. Partnership has become a renewed emphasis throughout the district. Those who gathered this summer at the district convention definitely heard that, and many have begun having conversations about partnering with other ministries, other Lutheran churches and schools in their geography. And we really want to hear from the two of you about the experiences that you have had, insights that you may want to share. And so please share with us really any significant discoveries that you have had about the partnership experience.
I can jump in here. That's Drew Ross here that's responding. And let me tell you this. I think that oftentimes when it comes to partnership, it's a better way, right? We see this as we jump into friendships, relationships, communities. It's oftentimes a better way, but that doesn't mean it's the easier way. And so I think that's something of significance for us to recognize, is that jumping into partnerships, jumping into collaboration with other people, it might be a better way, but it's certainly not going to be easy. But I will tell you this, at least to show my hand a little bit, I would say this, that the joy of being in community with people in a merging partnership process is extreme. And the level of joy, I would say, is much higher than what I had anticipated before I jumped into the merging process.
Drew, your congregation experienced a merger with another nearby congregation.
Mm-hmm.
You had functioned independently, although you had that shared synodical connection. Talk to us about the way that was initiated.
Absolutely.
I mean, was there somebody who drove that or got that started?
So our two congregations in Costa Mesa and in Huntington Beach, we were in a shared circuit. So for the Lutherans that are listening, especially in Lutheran leadership, we know that there are joint circuits around our district, geographically based mostly, that bring churches together. But yes, we were completely independently functioning as congregations, but there was a relationship that had already started because we were in a circuit. And then what started to happen is this. It's mostly a relationship that involves sacrifice, is that we learned that there was something special going on in Huntington Beach. They were a unique congregation. They were connected in their community. They were very, very much alive. However, they weren't going to be able to continue as a congregation in the way that they were before. So for us, the way that it started is really their Pastor Dr. Richard Paul, who was over there before he and I started to get together over lunches. And through conversation, we started to say, what does it actually look like or mean for two congregations to be in a greater partnership together? And even in a merging process of two becoming one. And so, of course, now what we're at is we say we are one church in multiple locations. But it all started initially from relationship, conversation, where a lot of trust was built, and realizing that we were interested in taking the next step for the kingdom of God. And that was the purpose. What's the next step?
Quincy, you are experiencing a shared pastorate. You are serving as the pastor of two different congregations that continue to otherwise work and minister independently. Share a little bit more about that experience and its initiation.
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to step into this partnership after it had already kind of taken form. So similarly, we had a circuit relationship. So these two congregations are in the same circuit. And the circuit visitor at the time was a retired pastor who was kind of helping both congregations through the calling process, and began the idea of talking with them about what would it look like if you guys came together in some form. And so he got that ball rolling. The reason that they considered all sorts of partnerships. There was the talk of merger. There was a talk of all different directions that they could go. But the key thing for each one was that they had well-established school ministries in each location. So each location had a preschool already, as well as Christ the Cornerstone goes all the way through 5th grade. So we have preschool through 5th. And so they wanted to maintain those ministries in those unique contexts. And so they decided that maybe a dual parish, a shared worker type situation would be best. And so they proposed the idea. The two congregations kind of worked through it on their own time. And then that was served for a period of time by that circuit visitor who helped them come up with the plan. And then they called me. So I was directly out of the seminary. This was my first call, and right out of the gate into a dual parish situation. And I've truly loved it. Talking with some of my fellow classmates who've gotten placed in a variety of locations, we have a lot of commonality. A lot of the churches that we stepped into face challenges. I mean, many congregations face challenges. And one of the things that I was really struck by, thinking about dual parish specifically, was the way that the dual parish provides stability for each congregation. It provides a sense of foundation to build off of, and it gets them out of the survival mode and allows them to really think about, who are we? How can we serve our neighbor? And where do we want to go? Rather than just, how do we make it to the next month, the next year, thinking long-term and strategically about, how are we going to continue to be in this community for another 50, 60 years?
I'm hearing from both of you that there are some incredible discoveries and some genuine opportunities that come from partnership. But another word I heard was sacrifice. Talk a little bit more about that. What is being sacrificed? Like, to what extent are ministries experiencing a measure of sacrifice to experience a partnership?
Congregations have a unique identity, and some of those identities have been formed over time. And with identity comes traditions. It comes things that people rely on. It becomes things that they enjoy and that they like. However, the Christian life itself is filled with sacrifice. Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me." And in other words, what he's saying is hey, get ready to sacrifice self when you're going to follow after me. It's not always going to be comfortable. It's not going to be easy, but it will be done so that others will experience the forgiveness that comes from Jesus and him alone, crucified and risen again. Therefore, the Christian life, we should anticipate sacrifice. And when we're talking now about ministries forming partnerships or mergers, while there's all kinds of beauty that goes along with it, there is sacrifice. I'm going to sacrifice some of my traditions so that the power of the gospel remains on my lips. I'm going to sacrifice some of the rhythms that I've known in my church for years, or in some cases, people would say for decades, because I care less about following that same tradition, and I care more that there will be people who hear the gospel because of this worshiping community that continues to exist and thrive together. So sacrifice is a necessity.
Has that been experienced differently by the churches in Poway and Mira Mesa, because they continue to have their space and their worship and that type of thing? And yet, was there sacrifice involved in that partnership?
Yeah, there's definitely a sacrifice and a change of perspective when a congregation goes from having one full-time worker that is at their full disposal to, understanding that this is a shared situation. So like my office hours are split within a week in each place. Now, obviously, when things come up, if there's an emergency and I need to go see somebody, the line is not a clear cut in between. But, there is just kind of that element of, the pastor can't always be at the soup supper at 6:00, or some of those traditional things of what we're used to or what they might have expected of a pastor before. They kind of have to change that perspective a little bit, and just to understand, I'm only one man and there's only so much I can do.
Among the phrases that I shared at the district convention was an emphasis on kingdom opportunity over congregational viability. And even as I've had opportunity to reflect on that, the word viability doesn't just refer to existence, but it also references expression, the way you've done things, the rhythms, as you use those words. And sometimes congregational viability is releasing the ability to do it the way you've done it for the sake of the kingdom opportunity and what it is that God might be doing among you.
Can I say this? Here's an observation that I've had in our merging process and our partnership process, is that people, followers of Jesus, okay, even prayerfully, I'm talking here about mature followers of Jesus, but we got people all along the line here, right? that people are willing to be stretched when the main thing remains the main thing. Here's what I mean by that. People are willing to sacrifice. They're willing to see something different as long as, here it comes, followers of Jesus, as long as we are by all means preaching Christ and Him crucified and risen again, and I bought into that mission, now I'm willing to be stretched. And I think that's a part of it, as long as the main thing remains the main thing.
Anytime we have a new experience or we journey down a new path, there are going to be some pitfalls and obstacles. Presumably, the congregations you serve have experienced that in these partnerships. Share with us a little bit about that, about things that, people may want to watch out for, or things that your congregations may have even done differently.
I'll jump in here, and this isn't necessarily a pitfall that we have fallen a long ways into. However, it is something we have always been aware of, and it's this, is that over-communication is necessary. Another way to say that is that a failure to communicate the same information over and over and over and over and over again will result in Great Aunt Frida saying, well, I didn't know about that. And the safest way to make sure that we remain unified and walking together is to say over-communication is necessary. When we start to sound like a broken record constantly, we're probably almost communicating enough, right? But over-communication allows people to have a trust that is formed and continues to exist.
I totally agree with what you said. And I kind of think with that too, an emphasis not only in communicating your events, but also doing things together, spending time with one another. In a partnership situation, you can be a partnership on paper. You can share a person who comes and visits one group here and then comes and visits another group here. And that can work, but it's so much better when all of the people get together and spend time with each other, get to know each other. One of the things that I wish we had done more sooner, that we've since done more of, is joint fellowship type activities between our two churches and also within our circuit. One of the things that I'm most proud of is for our midweek Lenten services, all of our circuit pastors rotate between each other's congregations. And so we have kind of a sermon series that we use, and then each of us is given a week, and we do that same week in multiple locations. And so I'm in the congregation of another pastor, and that pastor's in one of my two congregations. And so an opportunity for our people to get to see each other, to see other church workers, to get to know the fellow members of the body of Christ in their community has been really, really important. And I think, too, just the more that the people got to see each other and know each other, the deeper the bond between our congregations got. And I think especially about our ladies' Bible study, phenomenal group of women that meet on a Thursday morning. And when they first started, it was 3 or 4 ladies. And now they're up to 16 that are members representative of both congregations and some others from the area who just decided to tag along. And so because they have gotten to know each other, because they work together and they see each other regularly, there's just a deeper bond in that partnership. And they're excited. They share about what's going on in each place.
That emphasis on relationship is impactful. We are seeing a variety of different partnership discussions and pursuits across the district. The two of you certainly represent some fantastic experiences, but among the partnerships we are pursuing is with 4 congregations in the Los Angeles area, none of which currently have a full-time pastor. And the district is walking with them to discuss and discover what shared ministry may be. Does that include all 4 churches together, or 2 and 2, or, any number of different options that are out there? And as we have offered them some wisdom and insight as they are engaging in that discussion, among the things that they have shared is we need to get together more often just to get to know each other. We've got to develop some relationship for this to be effective.
Absolutely. And a little bit ago, I was answering one of your questions, and I was saying how when Dr. Richard Paul and I would get together, it wasn't a formal business meeting. It was at Luna Grill. Let's call it. It was we'd sit there and eat over. I'd have my Euro fries, okay, and that's where this all started, and it's where relationship was built. It's where friendship was bonded, trust was increased, and we realized when sitting down around a table in the middle of Huntington Beach that, you know what, I think that this could lead to a greater gospel purpose. And it's what led us to this great conversations of partnership. If I can reflect back also, the question you were asking just a little bit ago, there's a cost that comes with doing this, right? But there's a cost for every single thing that comes in life. But churches and church leaders need to recognize that there is a cost that comes from even doing the right thing, even when it leads to gospel proclamation. And I would say this, when a church is even thinking about this, when leadership is thinking about this, take into consideration, what are the financial costs? There's the easiest one to think about. What are the financial costs? What are the norms costs? What I mean by that is, what are your norms right now that you might need to? I'll return to that word sacrifice, but might need to be cost there. What are your tradition costs that are going to happen? And it's important for congregations to realize that there is a cost, but the cost is likely worth paying. It's in Luke chapter 14. That's that parable. It's actually even called the cost of discipleship, if you remember this. And let me reflect on just a few verses here. Beginning of verse 27, it says, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower," here it comes, build a tower, "does not first sit down and count the cost?" That's what our church is. That's what our leadership needs to do as well. We need to sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it. Otherwise, here it comes, otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, "This man began to build and was not able to finish." Well, if the goal that we have, and it remains the main thing in the church, is that Jesus is proclaimed constantly, then let's at least have the conversation ahead of time. What costs are we willing to bear? What costs are we willing to spend? Otherwise, what people might do is that they'll look in at synodical church leaders. Unfortunately, this happens far too often. And they say, well, they were willing to talk about it, but they weren't able to pay the cost. They weren't able to sacrifice self. And they weren't even able to do it for the kingdom of God. And so therefore, if people are watching from the outside, they'll say, now, is that a reason that I don't desire to participate in the Christian life? Oh, that's killer. That's daggers to the heart. However, if the outside world is able to look at us and say, but look at those organizations or organizational leaders that were willing to come together and pay the costs so that their main mission remains the main thing. Wow. Now that's a testimony.
And the great assurance of our faith is our crosses are born in the shadow of the cross of Christ. That cross is the testimony that God redeems all things, that he works through all things for our good, that if he would redeem that cross and all Christ suffered for us, he will redeem our crosses for good. And so often that is not mentioned or emphasized as we get into discussions about spiritual development or spiritual formation. We highlight prayer, we highlight devotion, but we don't often highlight sacrifice or the cross. And it is such an essential part of Jesus' description of being a disciple and what it is we might experience.
I love how you use that word redeem even there, because sometimes I believe that we, even in the church, we can become paralyzed and not making the harder decisions, right? Because we think, well, if I make the wrong decision, then game over, it's all done. No. We believe in a God of redemption, who, when I do step into his will fully, he blesses it. And even when I step outside of his will, not on purpose, but because I'm trying to make the right decision, but I'm a fallen and sinful person, God then steps in and says, I can redeem that too. And he will always bring about his purposes. Whether I make the right decision or the wrong one, we are simply vessels that he uses, and he redeems us, even when we were unwilling or unable to make the right decision.
Let's talk a little bit about the first step, because there may be people listening to this podcast who are considering that kind of partnership. And maybe it is born out of a season of struggle in their ministry, and they're not sure what God has next. Or perhaps it is born out of an interest in mission and doing things a little differently. What's the first step? And you guys have had some different experiences. Drew, you are a part of it. Quincy, you've heard about it. But what was the first step that happened for your congregations?
I think the main one, and it's going to go back to a theme that we've talked about already, is the relationship. I mean, individuals in the congregations, leadership of the congregations need to start getting to know one another, to spend time with each other, and really just see, what is it that each brings to the table? What kind of strengths and weaknesses do they have? How can we work relationally and begin the conversation? I think the worst thing we can do is just remain isolated. In our context, it's so common to just, turn inward when things get hard. But really seeking out the support of your fellow brothers. If you're a pastor in a church who's struggling, go to your circuit meeting. Get to know the fellow guys around you, because, they're in the trenches with you. They're there to support you. And you can be there to support them as well. I think that's really, really, really important.
And people don't always appreciate that they have the opportunity to initiate that discussion. Often people will turn to us as a district and ask that we intervene or be a part of that. And we're definitely here to be in ministry with all churches and workers and all kinds of different things. But often we find ourselves encouraging people to reach out to that neighboring congregation, or just to say something and to know that that's all right. Not only is it all right, it's incredible to be able to initiate that conversation.
Fear causes us to do nothing. And yet, when we don't respond to our fear and instead we respond by making the phone call, that's what leads to something happening. For any pastors that are listening, maybe you're the same like me, and there's sometimes that a person in the congregation that crossed my mind, maybe they've been in the hospital, maybe something's just gone on in their life, and I know that, and it's crossed my mind, maybe you should call them, Drew. Maybe you should call them and say something. And then I think, well, I don't really have the time for that. I don't know if they have the time for that. And I convince myself not to. I'm filled with regret. I just responded to the fear in my life.
And I suspect you've never regretted doing it.
When I've actually made the phone call, right? This is where all the pastors who are listening would probably agree. When I actually made the phone call, every single part of me was glad that I did. Every single ounce of my being was glad that I did. And perhaps the same kind of thought needs to be put into this process. If we have fear, we do nothing. But what happens when we actually make the call? Hey, you want to do lunch? I got something I want to share with you. Hey, you want to send the email? I've got something that I heard about. Let's at least explore this together. I think it's worth it.
Every member of these congregations is critical in these partnership discussions. Share with us a little bit the things you have heard from members of your congregations about the process, about the experience, about the discovery when it comes to ministry partnerships.
A story that comes to mind is one that's probably not unique to our context, but we have a person who has been a longtime faithful member of one of the congregations, but in their longer, broader history, they had actually been a member of the other congregation and left kind of on bad terms, and were frustrated with things that were going on there. But through the partnership that we now have, the time that they've now spent getting to see up close the ministry that's taking place there, they have gone so far as to help us establish a scholarship fund for students of that school, of the congregation that they once left, that they're now in partnership with and lovingly supporting. I just think that's such a beautiful story of healing that can happen, especially in areas where, there's a number of Lutheran churches and people might bounce from one to the other. I think just reclaiming the health of our broader church body is a beautiful thing.
In Costa Mesa and in Huntington Beach, our two campuses now, Costa Mesa was called the Leading Church, okay? And Huntington Beach was called the Joining Church. And so there were these kind of presuppositional thoughts that we had. One of those was that, well, in Costa Mesa, since we're the leading church, we're going to breathe all of this life into the people of Huntington Beach because they must not have any life that they can offer anymore. And what has been so wild that we have absolutely loved is that while Costa Mesa thought they was going to breathe this life into Huntington Beach, this church in Huntington Beach that was always talking about death, they have brought so much life into Christ Lutheran Church, one church with multiple locations. It's unbelievable, the life that came out of a church that was supposedly be the ones who were bringing death and slowness, have brought life into the community, and it has brought life to the entirety of our whole organization.
Were there resources that either of your congregations used during this process? Maybe it was a book that you read or a website from which you drew, or even a person that you consulted to help navigate you through this experience.
I'll speak of a resource that we did use, and I'll tell you, I've gone through this process over my time in ministry a few times. And this resource that we use for this merger process was wonderful and brilliant, and I highly recommend it. There's a book that's called Better Together by Warren Bird and Jim Tomberlin, and I highly recommend it because it does a great job of using current language. It does a good job of providing adoptable language that people experiencing this new form of partnership can use together, while also providing a roadmap that is healthy and good for multiple organizations that are seeking to merge together.
So we also used the same book, funny enough. And that's been a helpful resource for, like you said, kind of shared vocabulary, shared understanding, and celebrating the idea of the partnership, that we truly are better together. And just, it's a good thing to remind people of that and just celebrate what you want to accelerate. Put forward the things that you're excited about. When you see the partnership going well, celebrating it in both places is worthwhile. That's huge. As far as dual parish kind of resources, I know we're hearing more about it. It's a fairly new concept to certain areas. Historically, it's been in more of a rural context. You think small town. I grew up in Nebraska, so you've got small town Nebraska where, there's 3 towns next to each other. Each of them has a Lutheran church. There's maybe 2,000 people between all 3 communities, and they're all trying to stay viable. And so they'll come together and do a dual parish or a tri-point parish. It hasn't been done as much in more urban, suburban communities, but it is happening more. And so I think there will need to be more resources for it in the future. And I hope that those resources do get developed. Something that we put in place pretty early on that I think was really helpful was a dual congregation parish committee. So it's an opportunity for us to come together regularly with leaders from both congregations and work through anything that comes up. So it's not an every month meeting. It's kind of an on, if we're too busy, if things are going on, like we're not going to meet in December when we're in the middle of Advent, but we will meet in November leading into Advent to discuss the schedule, to work out anything that might come up. I think it's important to have that relief valve, have that communication flow. We end every meeting with, is there anything going on in the congregation that the other church needs to know about? And it's always joyful when that's silent, but it's helpful to constantly be communicating with each other. And so I think if you're going to be in a partnership like that, setting up a good structure for how you're going to meet, how you're going to regularly evaluate what's going on, those are really important things to do.
Drew Quincy, we are blessed to have you as pastors in the Pacific Southwest District to partner in ministry with you. As we have just another minute or so, I want to invite you to share any word of wisdom you might have about anything. Might be about ministry, partnerships, anything that you may want to share with podcast listeners.
Sure, I'll jump in on this, but I'm just inspired actually by what Quincy had just said. We're talking about that dual parish team that they brought together. We had done the same process. We just called it our unification team, right? We can just apply it to our own context. And when we go through these partnerships, because there will be some who feel threatened, there will be some who feel excited, there will be some who are grieving, and there's so many different types of responses. The more transparency, the better. And so when I talk about this unification team that we had as well, is we brought together some leaders from our Costa Mesa campus, some leaders from what is now our Huntington Beach campus, and we just walked through this whole book together. Right? We just walked through the roadmap. We just talked it through, brought in food, and we talked it through, not one time, but I mean regularly. We just kept the conversation going so that there were no surprises. And as we continued the conversation and continued in relationship, those who were defensive at first, it subsided a little bit. Those who were grieving a little bit less. That transparency was absolutely critical for people to be able to remain willing to take the next step And so while partnership is worth it, it's challenging, and I highly recommend that whatever ounce of transparency you can give into the process.
I agree with the idea of the challenges that are kind of natural in partnership. Working together is always going to be more challenging, but more rewarding. I would also say don't undervalue or underestimate the potential joy that can come as a result of the partnership. You might be able to do something that you hadn't been able to do before. Together, you may not have had enough children between the two of you to put on a VBS. But now that you have two churches with two groups of people, two volunteer pools, two groups of families, you might actually be able to come together and do something amazing. It can be true of any type of work of the church. I'm most excited when we have a volunteer at one congregation who hears about a need at the other church and is willing to kind of go across the lines and help in that way. We had an issue with a light switch at one of our congregations. The other congregation has an electrician. He's coming on Friday to work on it. It's a beautiful thing when they work in partnership like that.
Thank you both. And thank all of you for listening to this PSD podcast. We invite you to learn more about the district at psd-lcms.org or to reach out and contact us if we can help you with a ministry partnership.